3-year-old Dorothy was playing when she accidentally fell down a flight of stairs and hit her head, which knocked her unconscious. When her parents found her, she wasn't breathing. They called the doctor, who rushed over immediately. Dorothy's mother broke down when the doctor said there was nothing he could do. Her little girl was dead. The doctor left and returned an hour later with Dorothy's death certificate and gently discussed arrangements for the little girl's burial. But during this conversation, shuffling was heard coming from Dorothy's room. They ran upstairs, and there she was, playing in her room like nothing had happened. The doctor examined her again, and there were no signs of injury. He had no explanation. He said it appeared as if Dorothy had come back from the dead. He didn't realize then just how right he was. This is Porch Lore. And I'm your host, Devin. This is the tale of the reincarnated Egyptian. Dorothy Eady was born in London in 1904, and until her fall down the stairs and resurrection, she was a normal little girl. But after the fall, she started having night terrors. Her mother would wake her and Dorothy would tell her about the dreams. She told her mom that she was living in a huge columned building, surrounded by trees and green gardens. It was always the same dream, and Dorothy would continue to tell her mother that she wanted to go home. Her mother would explain to her that she already was home, and Dorothy would become frustrated and oftentimes depressed. Sometimes Dorothy's parents would find her pouting under the dining room table. They'd ask her what's wrong, and it was always the same answer. She wants to go home. When she was asked where home was, Dorothy would say she didn't know. She just knew that she wanted to go back there. After the fall, Dorothy would occasionally speak with a heavy foreign accent. This became so unsettling that Dorothy's parents started having trouble finding a sitter. When Dorothy was 4, her parents planned a day at the British Museum, but since they couldn't find anyone to watch their daughter, they brought her along. As expected, 4-year-old Dorothy was bored in the museum. She moped, she dragged her feet, she acted like most 4-year-olds would act in a museum. But then, Dorothy's mood drastically changed when they reached the ancient Egyptian exhibit. Dorothy was dazzled by the artifacts. But when she saw the Egyptian statues, she tore herself from her mother's grip and ran wildly through the halls. Dorothy was running from statue to statue, kissing their feet and yelling at people for wearing shoes in the presence of gods. Dorothy's mother was mortified at her daughter's behavior, but then Dorothy suddenly stopped and became silent. Dorothy's parents found her in front of a glass case, frozen. She was staring at the face of an Egyptian mummy. Dorothy's mother picked her up, but she got upset. Then, in a voice that sounded like an old woman, Dorothy told her mother, "These are my people." It took Dorothy's parents a few hours to finally drag her out of the museum. But whenever the family had free time, they would take Dorothy back to the Egyptian exhibit. It was the only place where their daughter felt happy and peaceful. When Dorothy was 7, her father bought her a children's encyclopedia about ancient Egypt. Dorothy spent hours studying hieroglyphics with a magnifying glass. Her mother would ask her what she was doing, and Dorothy would say, "I'm trying to remember." While reading a science magazine, Dorothy came across a picture of a temple built for the pharaoh Seti, father of Ramses the Great, in the town of Abydos. Dorothy was confused. She asked her mother where all the trees were and all the green gardens. Dorothy's mother asked, "What is this place?" Dorothy smiled the biggest smile she ever had in her entire life and pointed to the picture of Seti's temple in Abydos and said, "Mama, this is my home." Children remembering their past lives is more common than most people think. There are thousands of documented cases, and these are just the cases that parents report. There are certainly thousands more cases where the parents are too confused or too embarrassed to report it. Almost every case of past life memory starts at around age 2 or 3 and ends around age 5. But not so with Dorothy Eady. As she got older, her memories became more clear. It was just a matter of time before Dorothy Eady would find out who she really was 3,000 years ago. Dorothy Eady was very outspoken about reincarnation. She spoke about it openly and didn't care what anybody thought. And this was a problem for a teenage girl in the 1920s. And sadly, it still seems to be a problem today. Her parents tolerated what they thought was just an eccentric quirk, but other people weren't so forgiving. One Sunday afternoon, a priest showed up at the Eady's door. The priest said that Dorothy was no longer welcome at Sunday school because she had refused to sing a hymn that spoke poorly about Egypt. But the last straw was when Dorothy argued with the Sunday school teacher that Christianity was based on the old religion of Egypt, which is actually true. But the church doesn't like to hear that, especially from a teenage girl. Dorothy had been spending so much time in the British Museum that Egyptologist Sir E.A. Wallace Budge got to know her and started teaching her how to read hieroglyphics. Unsurprisingly, she picked it up very quickly, like way too quickly. Dorothy's dreams continued this whole time, though now that she knew what was happening, she wasn't frightened anymore. When Dorothy was about 15, she would wake up in the middle of the night, almost every night. She heard the voice of a man named Hora, who asked her to write down everything he said. She would then go into a trance, neither sleeping nor awake, and scribble notes in hieroglyphics. When she woke up, she had no idea what she had written. It wasn't even her handwriting, and after a year of this, she had written 70 handwritten pages. She was finally able to piece together that this was the story of her life in ancient Egypt. She was an Egyptian woman named Bentrishit, born in the town of Abydos. She came from a humble background. Her father was a soldier who served during Seti's first reign, and her mother was a vegetable seller. When Bentrishit was 2 years old, her mother died. Unable to care for her, Bentrishit's father placed her in the temple of Qam el-Sultan, where she would be raised to become a priestess. When she was 12 years old, Bentrishit was given two choices. She would either leave the temple and go out into the world on her own, or become a consecrated virgin and stay at the temple. Bentrishit decided to take the vows. A few years later, she met Pharaoh Seti I, and they had an affair. When she became pregnant with the child of the pharaoh, she had no choice but to tell the high priest about her relationship with Seti I. The high priest told her that her sin against Isis was so severe that she would be tried and likely sentenced to death. In order to protect the pharaoh from a scandal, Bentrishit avoided the trial by taking her own life. Dorothy finally understood everything that was happening to her. For the next few years, she worked various jobs at a theater owned by her parents. But then she got her big break in 1931. A position opened up in London, writing for an Egyptian public relations magazine. The 30s were a tricky time in Egypt. Though it was officially declared independent from the United Kingdom in 1922, the UK was still heavily involved in the governing of the country. Dorothy used her new position at the magazine to advocate for Egyptian nationalism and full independence. While working for the magazine, she began corresponding with a wealthy Egyptian man named Amin Abdel Maguid. In 1933, Maguid proposed. She accepted and finally traveled to Egypt for the first time in her life. Well, first time in this life. When she stepped off the boat in Cairo, she fell to her knees and kissed the ground. She wept and said, "I'm finally home." And if Dorothy Eady really was reincarnated, now she'd have the chance to prove it. Dorothy's marriage was off to a rocky start. Her husband's family was wealthy and didn't like how open Dorothy was about her past life. She was more committed to Egyptian culture than her husband's family was, and she was outspoken about it. After a few years, Dorothy and Maguid divorced, but not before she gave birth to his son, who she named Seti. Then, Dorothy Eady changed her name to Seti, which means Mother of Seti. This is how women were known in ancient Egypt. In 1935, she took a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities. She was the first woman ever hired, but she quickly made a name for herself as a respected scholar. She published essays and articles about ancient Egypt and translated documents in hieroglyphics. Though Dorothy Eady had no formal training, she became known as an expert in the field. Finally, in 1952, Dorothy was able to take a job in Abydos, the town where she believed she had once lived. In Abydos, she became known as an eccentric by the locals. She observed ancient Egyptian religion, she walked barefoot everywhere, and she would spend her nights praying and sleeping in the Egyptian temples. In 1957, the new chief of antiquities wanted to test Dorothy. He admitted that she had an uncanny understanding about the ancient Egyptian culture, but he didn't really believe that she lived in the Temple of Seti thousands of years ago. So, one night, he escorted her to the temple. The only light they had was a torch. He then asked her to take him to different parts of the temple. At this point, nothing had been published about the layout of the temple, and Dorothy had never been there before in this life. Dorothy was able to guide him anywhere he asked, with no map and no light. She knew every inch of the temple. After his 6th attempt to stump her, he gave up. One of her recurring dreams of past life memories was of the gardens of the Temple of Seti, but those had not yet been discovered by archaeologists. Dorothy told the scientists where to find the gardens, and when they excavated there, they found it. And she said that if they dug on the north side of the temple, in a specific spot, they would find a hidden tunnel. And sure enough, the tunnel was there too. In 1964, she turned 60 years old, and by Egyptian law, she was supposed to retire. But not only was she the first woman hired by the Department of Antiquities, she was also the first person given special permission to keep working because she was too valuable of a resource to let go. Egyptologists couldn't explain how, but she was able to make countless discoveries just by remembering. Though her specialty was the Temple of Seti I in Abydos, she did claim to have knowledge of other ancient Egyptian sites. For example, she said the lost tomb of Nefertiti was underneath the tomb of her stepson Tutankhamun. Well, Dorothy made this claim in 1972. Tutankhamun's tomb was found in 1922, though the tomb had been studied for 50 years and there was no evidence of a chamber there. But get this, in 2015, radar imaging technology showed there actually was a chamber right where she said it would be. She also said there was a small library underneath one of the feet of the Sphinx. And sure enough, after LiDAR scans, she was correct. About 30% of Americans, including almost 25% of Christians, believe in reincarnation. To us, reincarnation might be fringe science or pseudoscience in the Western world. But in the East, reincarnation is viewed very differently. It is a central part of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism, and several other religions. For about a quarter of the world's population, almost 2 billion people, reincarnation is essential to their beliefs. The Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism, is said to be the reincarnation of Pema Dorji, the first Dalai Lama who died in 1474. The current Dalai Lama, who was born in 1935, is the 14th incarnation of Pema Dorji. When the Dalai Lama dies, senior Tibetan monks conduct an elaborate search to find his next incarnation. This search involves consulting oracles, interpreting visions, and reading spiritual signs. The current Dalai Lama was found at the age of 2 after a senior monk saw his village and house in a vision. The boy, then named Lamo Thundup, was able to identify items that belonged to the previous Dalai Lama, including a drum used for rituals and a walking stick. Reincarnation is a subject I've always been drawn to. To me, there is something comforting about the thought that death is not the end, that our physical life is just a temporary experience, meant to teach us lessons to prepare us for our next life, or to prepare us for what comes after. Dorothy Eady is one of the most compelling cases for reincarnation that I've ever seen. But is it really evidence? Skeptics will point out that while Dorothy Eady was able to identify many Egyptian tombs, tunnels, and rooms, she also got plenty of things wrong. And some believe that when Dorothy hit her head falling down the stairs, she injured her brain. This injury could have caused her to have foreign accent syndrome, which is a real thing. The injury also caused her to develop obsessive-compulsive disorder, with her obsession being ancient Egypt There's no question that if she developed this obsession at 3 or 4 years old, she'd become very skilled and knowledgeable about the subject. We know for a fact that Dorothy Eady was institutionalized multiple times for mental health issues. Also, all the stories about Dorothy's early life come from Dorothy herself. The fall, her experience in the museum, the trance writing, the time she was tested in the darkness at the temple. There's no evidence any of this happened. Even famous Egyptologists, who notoriously dislike anything mystical, said that Dorothy's knowledge of Egypt was beyond simple intuition. It was uncanny. Now, they stopped short of saying that she was reincarnated, but nobody denies her major contributions to the early study of ancient Egypt. Dorothy Eady has been called the patron saint of Egyptology. She lived out her remaining years near Abydos, just walking distance from Seti's temple, the place that since childhood she had considered her home. Dorothy finally died in 1981, never knowing that she was right about the library under the Sphinx's paw. But I can't help but wonder, is there a child out there somewhere right now, having dreams and visions she can't explain? Visions of her green garden in a far-off desert, vivid memories of that familiar oasis, once again, calling her home. Thanks for joining me, Porch Pals. If any of you have your own personal spooky or unexplained stories, I would love to hear them. Email them to me, and maybe I'll tell your story next.